Good evening and welcome. We're going to go ahead and get started with this evening's program. I'm Jana Irwin, the head of education for the Ulrich Museum of Art at Wichita State University, and it is my pleasure to introduce the second program in our new series of invited talks, Voices from the Vault. Taking place over the course of the next 5 years in the run-up to the museum's 50th anniversary, and coinciding with the Ulrich's efforts to make information about the entire collection available online, these programs will focus on the art made in the 5 decades of the Ulrich's existence and will illuminate the connections between the art of our time and the key events and phenomena of our shared recent history. For the 2019-2020 academic year, Voices from the Vault is exploring the collection in the 1970s. Last Tuesday, our first Voices from the Vault speaker, Catherine Morris, who is senior curator at the Sackler Center for Feminist Art at the Brooklyn Museum, discussed how the Ulrich's collection reflects the increased participation of women in the arts starting in the 1970s, and how museums can better narrate a history from a feminist perspective. Tonight, we will examine more closely the history of the feminist movement in the West, and particularly the rich history of women's activism in Wichita and its role in the national fight for equality. Thank you to our panelists for being here this evening, Dr. Novelene Ross, Lee Starkel, Carolyn Williams, and Dr. Robin Henry, and to Lee and Ron Starkel and Humanities Kansas for providing funding in support of this year's Voices from the Vault series. Novelene Ross holds a BA in Studio Art from Wichita State University and a PhD in Art History from Washington University in St. Louis. She wrote her dissertation on the influence of the popular image of women in the 19th century French press upon the art of the French Impressionist painter Edouard Manet. Ross held the positions of educator and chief curator at the Wichita Art Museum from 1973 to 2000. She acted as juror of early women art exhibitions in Wichita and organized an exhibition of contemporary women artists, all regional, at the Wichita Art Museum to celebrate the convention of the now political caucus in Wichita in 1974. Lee Starkel earned undergraduate and graduate degrees with an emphasis in women's studies from WSU and was student assistant and graduate assistant in the Center for Women's Studies office from 1979 to 1981. She co-coordinated the Women's Writing Series from 1981 to 2003, managed Women's Studies communications and public programming activities from 1989 to 2005, and was a member of the planning committee for the WSU Plaza of Heroines, which was dedicated September 19, 1999. Lee dates her first local feminist activism to her participation in the congressionally mandated Kansas Women's Weekend in July 1977. Carolyn Williams is a lecturer in the Women's Studies Department and received her Bachelor of Arts in Women's Studies and her Master of Social Work from Wichita State University. Her efforts extend throughout, and regardless of her role, she always keeps a focus on making an impact. Williams has served as case manager for the Midtown Ryan White HIV/AIDS Center and has served as a program initiative coordinator for Sankofa Health Collective, as well as a public speaker for the Student Support Services at Wichita State University. Williams is a native of Wichita and was an active participant in the civil rights movement in our community. Williams currently teaches diverse women in popular culture and gender, alcohol, and addictions. Our moderator for this evening, Dr. Robin Henry, is a scholar of gender and sexuality and legal and constitutional rights, including late 20th and 21st century civil rights movements. She earned her PhD in U.S. history from Indiana University in Bloomington in 2006. Currently, she is an associate professor in the Department of History at Wichita State University, serves as a graduate coordinator of the MA program and faculty fellow in the Dorothy and Bill Cohen Honors College, and is an editor for H-Scape, the online listserv for the Society of the History of the Gilded Age and Progressive Era. She is the author of numerous articles and chapters dealing with the construction of masculinity in the American West, Sexual Education in the Early 20th Century, The Effects of Legal Dormancy on Public Policy and Civil Rights, and the Memory of the Ludlow Massacre. Her book, Criminalizing Sex, Defining Sexuality, Sexual Regulation and Masculinity in the American West, 1850 to 1927, is forthcoming. Currently, she is working her second book on the Colorado jurist and juvenile legal advocate, Benjamin Bart Lindsay. Please help me welcome our panelists this evening, and I'll hand it over to Dr. Henry.
Thank you very much, and welcome to the fellow panelists. Tonight we're going to be discussing feminism in the American West. And what a lot of us have talked about in our planning sessions is really a sense of community and freedom and opportunity that have kind of trickled up through our own experiences in Wichita and throughout American history. The American West, or really even just the Great Plains, are often kind of the flyover zone. I heard that even this morning on NPR. And I think any of us who live here or spend any part of our lives here realize very quickly that that's too simple and a misnomer of the environment in which we're living. The American West, in many ways, has been a place for opportunity and for testing out and experimenting different ideas, ways of living, and placement. And that is also included in women's suffrage, women's rights. And so as a historian of women and gender, this is not a surprise to me when I find that the Western states are some of the first states to adopt women's suffrage and suffrage bills. Kansas being earlier than some in 1912, obviously was Wyoming goes in 1869, but even in municipal elections, women are allowed to and experience suffrage prior to many of their East Coast compatriots. So it doesn't come as a surprise to me that I'm sitting on stage with three activists of the 70s and people who participated in organizations that we often think about or teach about or learn about as East Coast institutions, but had a very real presence in the West, in Kansas, and in Wichita. So I want to start out with a question to all of my fellow panelists. Our theme tonight is the feminism of the American West in the 1970s. And as a region, we know that this is one that has open opportunity for women's rights. In what ways, and just kind of in a brief statement, in what ways do you think why was Wichita so open to women's movements and community-oriented activism and change in the 70s from your own perspective?
Well, as you said, Kansas was founded by progressives and abolitionists, so it was the home of the first local League of Women Voters in June 1919. The first national president of the League of Women Voters was Jane Brooks from Wichita. It's home to the first lunch counter sit-in. In 1958, and the Equal Rights Amendment was ratified here in 1972. So there was no shortage of activity. I think in the 70s, I think mainly the local women were really deeply aware of what was happening nationally, and kind of gave everyone permission everywhere to get active. There were local women's support groups here in the 60s and 70s. There were local chapters of NOW, Planned Parenthood, the National Women's Political Caucus, and of course, as I mentioned, the League of Women Voters were all very active in the early 70s. From my perspective, probably the most important galvanizing event that happened here was the Kansas Women's Weekend. That happened in July 1977. That was the result of the International Women's Year, and Congress mandated that every state hold a meeting to discuss women's equality and barriers to women's equality. And that was held here in Century 2. There were more than 4,000 people attended, which was twice what they had expected. And as was mentioned, I was there. It was a very contentious meeting. There were a lot of women and men, many of them from out of state, that had come to try to prevent discussions and support of women's equality, reproductive freedom, and the ERA. The goal was to vote on representatives for for Kansas, to attend a national meeting and to develop a platform on issues of importance to women in Kansas. That meeting brought a lot of women together who didn't know each other and kind of, as I said, galvanized. So after that meeting, there were a lot of agencies and organizations that were founded, including the Women's Equality Coalition, the City's Commission on the Status of Women, Work Options for Women, the Women's Crisis Center. So it was a really active time. I do want to give a shout out to Mira Monroe and Sarah Bagby and Watermark Press. They published a book a few years ago called Radiating Like a Stone. That's helped jog my memory for today, but it really documents what happened during that time period and written by the women who were involved. That's pretty rare that we have a document for a city that, again, documenting the activities that happened, and it is for sale, so at Watermark Books.
Carolyn, what about you? How did you feel the 1970s kind of affected your sense of activism and participation in Wichita?
It was really, can you hear me? It was really different. I basically really recalled women's activism in Wichita. Basically as a result of, in the 70s, as a result of the 1969 plan. And that plan was a plan administered by the school board to desegregate school system here. And both Caucasian women as well as African American women were equally involved, but for very different reasons. This plan was to introduce cross-busing, which was implemented in 1970. They appointed a Dr. Morse as superintendent in June of '68, which was a significant step. And he was African American, and they kind of assumed that he would bring stability to the program. However, that was not the case. The school board 1968 policy statement including resolved to comply with Civil Rights Act of 1964, to continue efforts to achieve staff integration, to end practice such as the use of portable classrooms, portable classrooms that have produced racial isolation, and use such measurement as pupil reassignment and transportation to desegregate the secondary schools. The administration considered Education Park as well as pairing, restriction, freedom of choice, and cross-busing programs as possible means of implementing the board policy. However, this plan was not working, and in 1966, Chester I. Lewis filed a lawsuit in order to ensure that African American students were getting the same education as other students. The administration eventually adopted a modified cross-busing arrangement, which became known as that 1969 plan. While the plan addressed racial isolation in secondary schools, it included no measures to correct the segregation noted by the Office of Education in 7 of the Wichita elementary schools. One of those schools that was closed in that implementation was a school called Matheson Junior High School, which is where I attended school. So it was real different just going to an integrated school, because after W.C. Little was the first school, the elementary, which was in the pilot program for integration. And it's real different when you've been around, everyone that's around you look like you. And so it was a real difference, and parents really did not like that because neither parent, African Americans nor Caucasians, wanted their students or their kids bused when you had neighborhood schools. And it was a real rough time. There was a lot of violence in cities. Wichita was not a real smooth time or city at that area. There was a lot of conflict. African Americans were trying to find their place. There was a lot of racial tension here in Wichita, so it eventually, people adapted to it through volunteering their students to transfer, and at some point in time it was implemented mandatory that you had to go to a certain school.
So Novelene, you came to Wichita a little bit later in life.
Right. My parents came here in 1949. My father came to work in the aircraft plant. And I tell you, this city, this state is far more radical than anyone outside of the Midwest seems to imagine. You know, we are known, literally, Kansas, the world over, because of the Wizard of Oz. And really, I'm not ashamed of that. I'm kind of proud of it. And I have an affection for flying monkeys. And so I love Kansas and its history. And you know, there are two eras. We're talking about the 70s. There are two eras of profound change in the 20th century U.S. culture. It was the 1920s, and it was the 60s and 70s. And Kansas produced some pretty strong leaders, feminine leaders in both of those eras. And if you want to look back to the 20s, you will find that Kansas hosted one of the major socialist newspapers of the nation in Girard, Kansas, the Appeal to Reason. And you will know that that was that the mining industry there depended exclusively on immigrants, people who were new to the culture, new to the language, people who could be exploited, who much more easily even than English-speaking workers. Well, it was women, a group of, when the men went on strike in 1921 because of the dreadful conditions of working, and they were cut out from labor. They were not allowed to come to work. It was their mothers and their sisters and their wives and their daughters who eventually formed a kind of coalition, 1,000 strong and more, and protested for over a month, maybe 2 or 3 months, I don't remember, that they protested against the mine owners and the scabs, and that was this group of women in southeastern Kansas were the founding movement for the National United Mine Workers. I mean, so don't let anybody tell you that Kansas is a dyed-in-the-wool, red, conservative state, and there's nobody here who believes anything other. Sorry to get political, it just happens to me. But in the 70s, well, no, I want to go back, got to go back to the 20s, to Louise Caldwell Murdoch, who is the founder of the Wichita Art Museum, which now holds a collection of American art that is not only nationally known, but internationally known. Loan requests from around the world come for certain paintings in that collection. And the reason it exists, and it was founded at the same time as the Whitney Museum in New York City, It was founded because of the vision and of this one woman who had the means, the educational means, the financial means to disperse charitable funds. And what she chose to do was to create a cultural institution that she wanted to have serve the community, but especially serve women. She had had the advantages of education in New York. She attended the Parsons School of Design and was exposed to theories of modernism, that is, of blending beauty with function. And she she herself was a businesswoman. She had great success. So what did she need to do? She was an impassioned person. It was her mission to give those gifts to those around her. She wanted the women who lived in the Midwest, who lived in rural communities, who were isolated from all of these great cultural offerings because of their geographic location and because their lack of money. But so she founded a women's club, the 20th Century Club, so that she could lecture, other women could be invited to lecture, women could educate themselves. And she created design trunks that could be shipped around to rural communities so that the isolated women would have a chance to teach themselves more information about how to make their homes more attractive, more comfortable, more amenable to their desires. I mean, this is radical, not just then, but it's radical now. How many times have you heard of some very rich industrial mogul who's built himself an art collection, and then he wants to go and build a building, name it after himself, and have this wonderful monument celebrating his great taste and wealth and status and so forth? Mrs. Murdoch did not own an art collection. She left the funds and the instructions to the city of Wichita. It was private gift merging with public entity to create an institution that would serve the people. It wouldn't be a monument to her. It wouldn't be private. It would be open to the public. And beyond that, her vision was radical for the time. She said it was not to be devoted to European art. You know, America had been stuck in the shadow of England and all of Europe for all of its development. But finally, artists were breaking through. There were serendipitous circumstances that enhanced her vision, her mission, her gift, and her success. But it was really stunning that we would find in Wichita, Kansas, a woman who was as far-sighted as Gertrude Vanderbilt Whitney and had an even better vision. Beyond just collecting contemporary art, she said it had to be contemporary art of diverse media. That is, it wasn't just the elitist media of sculpture and painting. It was also textiles and ceramics and glass and whatever media artists, craftsmen could work in. So here was, I think, an enormous democratizing force right here in Wichita. So our museum grew up along with the Whitney, and although we didn't have as much money, the Gertrude Vanderbilt Whitney assigned her assistant, Juliana Force, to be the first director of the Whitney. And Mrs. Murdoch made her assistant, Mrs. Navas, the curator of the collection. And it was Mrs. Navas who went to New York and met with with the few really inspired promoters of contemporary American art. She studied with Juliana Force and with the Whitney's curator, Lloyd Goodrich, and with the Edith Halpert, this immigrant Jewish woman who founded the first gallery in New York devoted to contemporary American art. I mean, the avant-garde. You have to sit back and gasp. We were, in the museum world, a part of the avant-garde. Don't forget that. Don't let anybody tell you that nothing can happen out there in flyover country. Anyway.
Thank you, Novelene. That's an excellent rendition of the radical history that is both feminist radical and economically radical that I know my students are just astounded by. They think of it as the red state, and yet it hasn't always been that way. So, Lee, you have mentioned that you were a student in the Women's Studies program, received your BA with Women's Studies, but you've also become a very active alumna of the Women's Studies program and active in the Center for Women's Studies. And could you tell us a little bit about the history of Women's Studies at Wichita State and how you personally found your way to the program?
Well, WSU is home to the second oldest women's studies program in the country. San Diego State established the first women's studies program in 1970, and today there are 645 women's studies, gender studies programs nationwide. At Wichita State, the first class was taught in 1971. Dorothy Walters and Annette Tanelsoff came out of the English department and decided they wanted to teach a class about the history of women's liberation that was happening at that time. So they structured this class. It was wildly successful, so they had to have the next year add additional classes. Carol Connick and Sally Kitch came, and all of these faculty were in the English department. They took up sections of teaching, and just the enthusiasm for it grew. Finally, it was because there was so much interest by students. There was other faculty, women faculty at WSU wanted to offer classes. The Dean of Liberal Arts at the time, Paul Magelli, enthusiastically embraced the creation of a program. The Board of Regents approved a major in women's studies in 1976, and then the establishment of the center itself in 1978. It was always an interdisciplinary program. That meant there were faculty throughout, especially the College of Liberal Arts, but also at WSU, designing and creating a program of classes. So in the first 10 years, there were 29 different classes taught by 22 faculty from 13 different departments. There are philosophy, minority studies, sociology, anthropology, English literature, let me think, political science. Were all really popular, and they were kind of supported anybody who wanted to develop something. I took my first women's studies class in the fall of 1978. I was a returning adult student at that time. That was the typical student at WSU. And I enrolled in women's studies my first semester, and from the late, great Carol Connick, and like so many people, thousands of people in this city and state and country, she inspired me, and I was hooked. There was no going back. I went on to take nearly every women's studies class that was offered at the time. It was kind of that pursuit of women's experiences that I hadn't learned anywhere else. Sally Kitch used to say we were all raised to be bright young men, and there was a whole nother world of experiences that was left out. And clearly seeing the hand of the patriarchy in our society and the structure of it and work opportunities, like I said, there was no going back. I got a job in the department my second year, 79, and I just kind of never left. There wasn't an office staff, so the student assistants and graduate assistant helped the faculty run the department, so that was great experiences for me. And I stayed and finished my master's. One of the things I started doing then was coordinating the promotion and management of the public programming activities, community outreach. The department was faculty were really involved in the community and very active on campus and would talk to anybody, and were engaged in so many of the organizations and groups I mentioned earlier. So it was a busy place. I kept doing that after I graduated. I worked on campus full-time for about 10 years, including at Student Support Services for 5 years. So I just kept doing that for the faculty, and then later I left and started a freelance communications business and managed, again, to continue to not go away. One of the best things that happened was the formation of the Community Council Advisory Board in 1979, so I was at the beginning of that, and that board really culminated in the creation of the Plaza of Heroines on campus, which it was such an important project. We connected with so many different women across the community. For me, it was lots of connections that have remained.
I know that when I was on campus for my job interview, they took me to the Plaza of Heroines, and I think it was maybe about as cold as it was today. They thought that that was somehow going to deter someone who loves cold weather. But I remember the Plaza of Heroines and thinking, okay, this might be a place I could be. I could find myself here. It spoke to me in a real visceral way that connected me to Wichita State and made me want this job in a way that kind of distinguished it from many of the other places I was applying. So it was great work. Carolyn, you are also part of and continue to be part of the Women's Studies program. Do you want to speak a little bit about how you came to Women's Studies and then how it has affected and shaped your work in the community as well?
Absolutely, Robin. I did not get the pleasure of being on the groundwork like Lee. I came in the department late, kind of roundabout way. I took a class from Dr. Carol Koenig, it was a women's leadership course, and I didn't really have an interest per se or a plan of what I really wanted to do at that particular time. But during this class, Carol left such an impressionable impression on everyone that ever met her. I loved how she taught the class. She just had this way of making each and every student just feel like they were just a part of her world. The one thing that she really encouraged people to do were to ask questions. And I was a student that had a lot of questions to ask. And even though there were a lot of turmoil in Wichita, and there was some unclarity, there was a lot of situation that was unresolved, we would talk about those issues. We would talk about why African Americans were not getting the same type of advantages that whites were getting. We would talk about why programs were not available for African Americans for low housing. Or housing subsidies. We would talk about how the schools were very different. And Carol always gave you information She was also like a reference book. She would say, you go look for it here, and this is this and that, and come back and talk to me. And not only that, but on a personal level, Carol would invite you over to her home. You'd sit around the table, and you just talk. And so I had a really love for her, and I liked her ideas. What I took away from Carol was fearlessness. I was encouraged, and I felt motivated. And I knew by Carol that if you didn't like something, it didn't take a lot of people to make a change. It only took one person. You just had to have the desire and courage to do so. So I became, at Wichita State, I joined a lot of different organizations. The first was, it was called, well, Jetty Blake, who was the director of, let me go back. I need to note Dr. Radigan in the 70s was the dean of students who had an open door policy, which meant you did not have to make an appointment to come into his office. And I think it was good that he did, because I don't know that he could have kept all of the appointments that people were making. And so you had a sense of awareness that you could go and talk to him, and that, you know, he would actually be really honest and address the issues. He may not have had the solution, but you felt that security of going and talking to him. Jetty Blake was an African American who was the director of Project Together, and he was working with African American students. So I was a part of Wichita State as the original African American Black Student Union, which was called Negro to Reality. A part of that membership was we weekly would go and help students to learn to read, math, and improve history skills at the Phyllis Wheatley Children's Home, which was a children's home for African Americans, which unfortunately it is closed. There were also other things that I was a part of at Wichita State, and that was because we were trying to find a place. African American students were trying to find a place at Wichita State because it was very different. There's a lot of diversity now, but during the 70s, it was not extremely diversified. So African American students created the first newspaper on campus. It was called Uru. We used it as a forum to communicate with the students at KU, the students at K-State, and Langston University. It also kept everyone aware of community events, which may include a protest, a sit-in, a march for something, but you were always aware. The other thing that I was involved in here was the basketball team in the 70s had, I believe there were majority African-American basketball players. And there was a cheerleader by the name of Joan Huff, who we all thought was exceptionally good, but could not get a spot on the cheerleading team. So as a result of that, the Negroes to Reality student body, as well as the African American guys on the basketball team, protested, and she was the first African American cheerleader. One of the other things that we did that I was very proud of was we were, as you guys know, and probably some of you participate in Hippodrome on campus, African Americans were not allowed in Hippodrome. Every time someone tried out, they were not accepted. They always had some type of issue. So again, we protested, and we were the first group of people that were admitted into performance in the Hippodrome, which it's not an issue now. So with that assurity, I got married, left, and came back later, and I knew what I wanted to do. I knew I wanted to be a part of the Women's Studies Department because I considered myself a real feminist. I had developed courage, I had developed organizational skill, and I was determined that what I wanted to make a change in, that I certainly could do that. And really, I have to give all praises to Carol Connick because she instilled that, I believe, into everyone that she met. And so I came back to school. I started with the Women's Studies Department. I started just taking courses, and I believe in 2003, I was asked to be Doris Chain TA. And from there, I continued to take classes. And then after I graduated, I was afforded the opportunity to become a lecturer. And that's what I have been doing since 2003 in the department. And I eventually went into women's studies for my master's. I completed everything except for 18 hours in the women's studies program and switched to social work, and that's where I graduated with my master's in social work. And I have 18 hours to complete in women's studies department, and I am going to complete those.
Excellent. Those are some great examples of using a foundation of women's studies and the leadership that I think we know comes out of women's studies departments in so many ways, to translate that into the larger life outside of the bubble of Wichita State in many ways. Speaking of outside the bubble, Novelene, as a former museum educator and curator at the Wichita Art Museum, what changes have you seen over the years, in particular in collections and directorships and curatorships, that speak to kind of this feminist spirit that you initiated us with?
Well, I do want to recall the atmosphere of the late 60s and 70s because it was a time of real upboiling in the social fabric. And we have several religious groups anchored in Wichita, and the Friends Church and also the Mennonites are very pacifist oriented. So there were women from those church groups who were leaders of protests against nuclear nuclear energy, right. And no, they weren't art protesters. And they were also civil rights activists, and they organized consciousness raising of students in within their educational groups to travel to Washington, D.C. and New York City and meet with national leaders who were organizing protests, especially for civil rights. So this was a city that was alert. And if you have to think that Chester I. Lewis is monumental. I mean, to have that sit-in demonstration here in Wichita before it happened anywhere else. You have to know that there were strong leaders, and strong leaders are people who have a real sense of urgency about making life better, and they have a deep empathy for the human condition, and they believe strongly in themselves that they can make a difference, and they are able to communicate this passion to others and bring them to life. And there have been many people in Wichita and on the WSU campus. And in the arts, I think one of the major movers and shakers, certainly in the art department, was the art historian Mira Monroe. She moved to this campus from New York with her husband because the university offered a double professorship. Her husband came as head of the English department, and then she had a tenure track position in the art department. And she, I'm telling you, she knocked us over. I remember the first time I saw her, I walked into her classroom, I think I was a sophomore or something, and the way she was dressed, I mean, she looked like she'd stepped out of Vogue magazine. She had this A-line dress that was geometric black and white, and she had white stockings and little black patent leather pumps, and her hair cut in a bob, and she had the attitude of the Empress Theodora, and she just knocked everybody out. I tell you, men and women, but women especially. We all fell in love with her. I had never seen a woman with such self-confidence, such worldliness, such a sense that the world and its history, its missions, its intents, its philosophies, were all out there for us to learn about and grab a hold of and take somewhere. And actually, the art students used to run away from the art history requirement, but when she came to the university, changed the whole thing. Everybody wanted classes with Mira. And it was not only the art students, but it was also the community. So you think about, if you read that book that Monroe edited and assembled, you would read a statement from the founders of Gallery 12, who they founded their cooperative in 1977, which is really quite early, and they had said, well, all we could do, we were stuck in art classes like, you know, here we are, women as decorative objects ourselves, and all we can do is create decorative objects that nobody wants. And they said they were darn tired of going to year after year just taking classes at WSU. Well, they encountered Mira too, and I'm sure that Mira set them alight. And they decided, we'll solve our own problem. So they formed a co-op in which they pooled their financial and labor resources and created a venue for contemporary artists in Wichita, and specifically women, female artists. And that spirit was abroad in the country. And so much has changed since then. I tell you, when I first entered work in museum world, women were not directors of museums or curators. The high positions were reserved for men. Nowadays, I read an article in the New York Times and said that at the level of mid-sized museums and small museums, women dominate. 53% of the directorial and curatorial positions are female. Now, I hate to suggest this, but it might mean that nobody thinks art history is important enough to give a man a job. But but art is and has been from time immemorial connected with power. It's connected to religious power, it's connected to political power, it's connected to financial power. So it's not, if you go in, you're going into the arts administration, arts museums, arts curating. You are entering the playground of the very, very rich. And it is, it's an interesting game, because museum workers, like teachers, are generally not paid a whole lot, but they do associate with the very rich. That is maybe I might exaggerate here. I actually did visit the home of Charles Koch once, but I say I actually saw him in his own home. So that is, I had some association with the rich. Well, anyway.
I think we'll have to call Novelene back for another intimate interview on the Coke home.
Right, no, it's probably. Women have entered positions of decision-making in the art world. There are many major gallerists who are female and who have helped develop the careers of some of the star performers in New York and LA. And you will see in our local museums and in national museums, there are a great many more exhibitions, solo exhibitions by women, more acquisitions of art for the permanent collection by women. Now, we're way behind, so it would take an awful lot of acquisitions to bring women to parity in the Wichita Art Museum collection, to bring us to parity with men. But you have to realize that we don't have a fortune to spend. But if you've read the news in the Times about the renovation of the Museum of Modern Art in New York, you know they are really serious. They decided to de-accession some works by men and replace them with works by women. So they had 5 works, say, by the modernist, French modernist Leger. They decided, well, we can sell one of those and bring in a contemporary female artist. I admire them for that. I think that's great. And they're also addressing a problem that all museums face. What do we do with these enormous collections we're assembling? And they decided, by gosh, we could take down some of the icons and put up some of these new women artists that we've collected. What a revolutionary idea. Actually show some of them. So the art world, it is really changing. Women can legitimately say they're still not promoted as widely or as well as men. Men are still the major stars. They're still the directors of the landmark museums and so forth and so on. But in a short period of time, really, things have changed dramatically.
And I think if you were lucky enough to attend Catherine Morris's talk last week, she kind of demonstrated some of the exhibitions that had come out that focused on the feminist collections and feminist artists of the latter part of the 20th century that have come out much more recently, often in times of political crisis. And so kind of that moment of feminist art seems to be happening, hopefully for a longer period of time than just 4 or 8 years.
Right. And there are artists feminist artists who are very outspokenly feminist, who declare and support the idea that there is a feminine sensibility, and that if you don't have work by women artists in museums, or if you don't have work by black artists or black female artists or artists of other American groups in the museum, you have limited your potential to acquaint yourself with the broader experience of life. If museums want to attract audiences, there's got to be a reason to come and see it. Why would black groups come if there's no work there by black artists? There's no faces there that are black. Their experience is discounted. Why would they come? You have got to see, and I think art is not behind. Art is an advance. It's a leader that, yes, we have got to make our world bigger. We have got to recognize that experiences in this group and that group are just as valid as the ones we've been celebrating all these centuries. In fact, I'll declare right now, I would rather see Judy Chicago's A Dinner Table than the Mona Lisa anytime.
Controversy in Wichita. We're always on the cutting edge. Lee, you've also become a really active member of the Ulrich Museum of Art here on campus. And one of the things, again, that attracted me when I saw Wichita State was that it has the only museum of modern and contemporary art in the state of Kansas, here in Wichita. I was wondering if you could kind of talk about your connections with the Ulrich and what you have experienced in terms of the growth of the collection, in particular as it relates to female artists, feminist artists, and feminist works.
Well, my first up-close and personal experience with the Ulrich that was most memorable was again, that first semester I came back to school. It's like everything happened for me. Ron and I were invited to meet Louise Nevelson. She was here for a show, and she was amazing, and her art is amazing, and that was again, a changing, galvanizing moment for me and for us. I also, that first semester, took Mira Monroe's art history class, and Novelene's right. She was like Carol, I mean, just unforgettable. And that class took me to the Ulrich Museum 3 times a week. It was the cut-through, that hallway, or the stairway is one of my favorite places on campus. Women's Studies itself worked a lot with the Ulrich over the years, and the School of Art and Design. And there was a lot of programming, a lot of activity that went on. Gail Davis, one of the later faculty members, had art history PhD, so that was a focus. We worked with them on bringing the Guerrilla Girls and Faith Ringgold and Yolanda Lopez, and then when Dahan Knob was director, he helped us secure the Sophia Vari sculpture that's in the center of the Plaza of Heroines. So it's been a long-term relationship. Ron and I, art has been a passion of ours since we were teenagers, so it was kind of natural that we came to openings and saw a personal connection with the Ulrich Museum, and it's been really great the last several years to have this new connection, new-old connection with Wichita State. There has been a focus on acquisitions of women, expanding the collection. We added Ellen Zimmerman's sculpture this year, and there's been new acquisitions by Judy Chicago and Faith Ringgold and a number of others. There's an awareness, as Novelene said, here as well as nationwide, a need to expand the collection. And being on campus, it's really critical that continues to happen. And it will. We have great staff, and we have for quite a while, so I just really encourage everybody. It's a free museum. You can go in there 6 days a week for free, so please join us and come to the openings.
I always tell my students, you're automatically a member of an art museum, whether you want to be or not. We have captured you, and you should go. It's really fun. Carolyn, you've also been involved a lot with community activism, and I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about what needs did you see for women in Wichita when you were working out in the community that either was things that you used your women's studies degree for or felt that needed to be more addressed within women's studies courses?
Sure. I worked in the community with HIV patients. I did my practicum with Dr. Sweet because it wasn't talked about, and it's because it's such a hard subject. It wasn't openly accepted. And so a lot of African Americans were not being tested. And as a result of that, the disease was actually running rampant. And you can just imagine, like, you're in a circle and you're passing a ball around. If you don't know that you have HIV, if you have the disease, then if you are having unprotected sex, that person also can have it. That person is having unprotected sex. That infects another person. And so it was just really going around, and nobody was talking about because it was an embarrassment. Nobody wanted anyone to know. And I was so thankful that Dr. Sweet, who has been she's nationally known, world-renowned for her work with HIV/AIDS. I had an opportunity to work with Dr. Foley, who is the dentist that was treating AIDS patients and HIV patients. And we still, even though it's become more aware, people are getting tested, we still have a long ways to go. We don't have enough facilities to house the people with AIDS, as well as another of my passion is we need to really work on African American infant mortality rate, because African Americans are the highest death rate for infant mortality. And no one really talks about this, and we don't know why that is, because, I mean, I know that there are some causes. Even in Kansas in 2013, Kansas had the highest infant mortality rate in the nations for Black non-Hispanic women. In Kansas, we had that statistic. I know that there are a lot of groups. I know specifically 3 groups that are trying to address this problem, but it's not enough. And I'm a firm believer that children are our future. And if they don't have an opportunity to have a life, how can they affect our future? And I just think we really need to address those 2 particular things, and particularly among African Americans, because it's affecting us. And third, the other thing was drugs. I do a course that deals with gender, alcohol, and addictions. And it's really important because at one point in time in Wichita, we had a really high rate of addiction in Wichita, particularly with cocaine. Cocaine, and which was a powder form used by Caucasian. African Americans used crack, which was the same form, and it's just a different form. It's the same, it's cocaine, but it's a different, they used it a different form. At the time that the rate was so high and it was killing African Americans, it wasn't being addressed. But now that we have a methane addiction, drugs are being addressed because that is also consuming our population. And we really do need to start doing more work with those 3 areas as far as I'm concerned. I'd love to see the statistics drop in all of those areas.
Absolutely. Thank you very much. Novelene, where do you see kind of contributions in rewriting the master narrative of art history? You spoke very briefly about MoMA's attempts, but where do you see that happening in Wichita, at WAM or at the Ulrich, or possibly even in the gallery scene?
Well, at first I want to comment on Carolyn's observations, and I want to ask her do you think if we had more women, and especially women of color, in political positions, in positions of leadership, do you think this would bring about a better focus on the issues that you have expressed concern for? Do you think more women in place would make a difference?
Absolutely, I do. It definitely, women see the need for things, and women allocate money and time with certain issues. And of course, there really needs to be more women involved in politics. And if you're involved in politics, you can be in the process of decision-making to change things, to get grants started.
Well, I happen to agree with that. I hope it comes about. But I do think that that's a part of really democratizing our government. Democracy is a process. It is in process. The United States of America did not give birth, like the Venus on the half shell, to democracy. It was conceived in a beautiful statement of independence, but it takes some grueling experience and work to bring that about. It's like part of the changes that sparked the civil rights movement were black men coming back from World War I and World War II and finding that nobody respected them as veterans. I mean, here is Veterans Day yesterday. Well, so have we always been such virtuous patriots and honored all those who fought for us? No, we haven't. We've got a long way to go. And I think in terms of just looking at museums, I would say the Wichita Art Museum and the Ulrich have both got, at least philosophically, their sights on making their museum more relevant to the community at large and to segments of the community that historically have not been regular patrons. I mean, you could talk to so many artists, established artists in this community, and they'll say, wow, I am so grateful because for my own personal training, I went to the Wichita Art Museum and I saw Edward Hopper. And, seeing Edward Hopper in the flesh it inspired me, it drove me, it gave me an example. But there's so much of our audiences that don't come to museums. So it's a challenge to the museums of today to figure out how do we expand what we are and what our mission is to democratize that audience, to democratize ourselves. We don't want to lower standards. We want to democratize access. We want to democratize relevance. And I think women being more visible, active, determinant in the ranks of museum directors have made a difference. They really have. There's a lot more kind of family-oriented, community-oriented activities in museums and much more effort to cultivate perspectives that have not been entertained as consonant with high art before. We're expanding our understanding of high art as well.
All right. Well, in the spirit of democratization, let us go ahead and maybe open up the floor for questions from you all. Anyone?
Thank you. First of all, I want to thank the panelists for this awesome presentation. Thank you so much. I am from Women's Studies in the present, but you have given me the opportunity to know where Women's Studies is coming from. You have gone to history, not just history of women's studies, history of activism in Wichita and Kansas, and sometimes in women's studies we theorize, a lot of theorizing from up there without knowing that what we're looking at in the upper shelf is down here in the lower shelf, right here in Wichita, a lot of feminist activism. So I thank you so much, all of you. And the question that I have is, from what you have described, I can feel a vibrant feminist activism in many directions, and civil rights. And so the question is, how did Wichita or Kansas walk towards the red sign?
Does anyone want to? Okay. Well, there is a slow but steady shift in Kansas. It's complicated by agricultural politics. It's complicated by new migrants from other parts of the country, from Texas, from Arkansas, Oklahoma, places that bring new, different ideas, sometimes radical ideas and sometimes more conservative ideas. You have a rising tide of religious conservatism that, as we also know, takes hold in Wichita in the 70s, 80s, and 90s. And so tides for political personalities of states change. I mean, we see that when we see the primaries in the elections that are happening throughout the country this season. And we'll see that, we saw that in 2016, we'll see that in 2020, that there are states that were, red states forever that are turning bluer or purple. There are blue states that are turning purple and possibly red. So the movement of politics is fairly consistent. But really, up through the early 90s, you still had a tradition of moderate politicians in Kansas. I know where I spent my high school years in Oklahoma, there were moderate Republicans and Democrats, a sense of bipartisanship that has, in many ways, left the stage for a moment or two, and really kind of divulged into cultural themes that are coming out. Abortion is one, but also gun rights, agricultural rights, the question of urban versus rural are driving a lot of the politics in Kansas that are framing it in a more red versus blue state fashion and putting Kansas much more in the red state. I would also argue more so than maybe even the general population actually is reflected in its political nature. Does Lee, anyone else want to add to that?
I don't want to go down what was it was a question of why has state
Kansas
become so conservative
Yeah.
when there are these? Part of it is the changing economic situation in which the industries that once sparked optimism and growth and expansion have declined. Yeah. The population is declining. We haven't yet created a place to live which is attractive to millennials and those younger. It's they have to. It's got to be where they have a place to work where they think they're going to be able to build their talents and build their incomes and whatnot. They do not want to be in a place that is shutting down. And that's a real challenge. And I think our whole nation is in transition. We haven't yet moved into the ways that we are going to where we can make the best use of our workers and our creative minds. And students, young people, they want to be creative. They want to do things. They're ready to go. But there's got to be a community commitment to seeing that can happen. And there's a whole lot of, there's many issues that are really a mess. I mean, they are so difficult, so complex, so much emotion is into them. We really need a sense of practicality and realism. What is going to make the nation the strongest, the most prosperous? You know, what are the activities, and who's going to have to contribute and pay up and do some work or whatever? So, I mean, there's a lot of really tough issues, and I think we're in what is those phases of grief? I think we're in the denial stage.
When I was moving here, I met somebody in the airport, never seen her before, who was from Wichita, and she was roughly my age, so around 30 or so. And she told me, Wichita is the place that I would choose to go back to die. And I was like, all right. And yet, I think that is part of the problem, is that there's a sense that there isn't a lot. There's things to do as a child. There's this bubble of your adult life, and then there's things for older people, and in this case, the woman coming back to die. But that there's also opportunity in that.
Yes, there's opportunity.
But there's a lot of opportunity that is open for people.
Dormant.
Yes.
No, I'm sure that it will come, but it may not be, I may not witness it or something, I don't know. I hate to end on a pessimistic note. Terrible. Can't you ask
Is there
something else?
another question?
Well, I don't have a question. I just want to say thank you to all of you, to Dr. Henry. And I will tell you that when I did the MA and LS, and one of my areas was women's studies and one was history, there were no female professors in the history department at Wichita State. And so getting that, whatever it was, our requirement from the history department meant that I was taking other history classes. So I'm glad you're here.
Thank you.
That's progress. I also will tell you that I didn't learn a lot about feminism. In fact, I knew nothing about feminism and issues until I moved to Wichita from Los Angeles.
Yeah.
So this is not as bad a place as sometimes we like to make it seem. I have some wonderful feminist sisters. Two of them are right here. And they were involved in women's studies before I was. So it's a good place. And I think one of the things that I learned in women's studies, and I thank Carolyn and Dr. Okafor for taking up the reins, but one of the things that I learned from one of the professors was the pendulum does swing. And so we just have to be patient. It doesn't mean you become complacent, but it does swing. And I think there's always hope as long as there are folks like you guys. I'm really excited, Dr. Henry, that you are here.
Well, thank you very much. And
And-
I'm always excited to engage.
That gives us hope. We've been around, and it gives us hope. So I'm excited. But I'm glad you're all here. But anyway.
Well, come on by Fisk. We offer classes. I offer classes in women's history, and I know that the Women's Studies Department coordinates with me on those classes too.
I'd like to thank you for this evening. This has been incredibly life-giving, and so I thank you all for sharing with us this evening. My question is that a number of years ago, President Jimmy Carter wrote a book called A Call to Action, and it was on looking at women's issues in this country and then worldwide, internationally. And one of the statistics that he gave was that the most dangerous place for younger women statistically in this country was either on a college campus or in the U.S. military. And I just would like your feedback on that if you have any.
Would anyone else like to take this?
Well, the violence in the home, I mean, we read it in the paper every day, so women are a danger everywhere. And the sexual harassment that happens in the military, we know it's really serious, but we also are seeing it everywhere. So, I mean, that pessimism is that things aren't changing enough.
I think also one of the optimistic things is in many ways the increase in statistics, because that does mean that women are coming forward more frequently in reporting and that they are being recorded. And while there is still an incredible amount of bias and naysaying, especially with working class women and women of color that are just not, or they're just not believed, there are more avenues open. And for Jimmy Carter to write that book, I mean, that's not really a book that we think of a Southern white man writing. I think that is of itself a remarkable feat to have an ally in the 70s write on that subject. And Jimmy Carter's administration is actually a really interesting one. I always tell my students I'm fascinated by who people choose for their cabinet. It tells you a whole lot about them. And Jimmy Carter chose more women, more African Americans, and more Hispanics, not just for his cabinet, but for positions of power within various administrations, agencies, for the federal benches. And so the people that you're seeing coming up through the 90s and the early 2000s to greater positions of power had their start because Jimmy Carter said, this federal government at all levels has to reflect the America that we are, not who we imagine we have been or some fantasy master narrative, but who we actually are. And I think that call to action is an incredible book that also speaks about the democratization and the process, that we have not gotten there yet, but that we are moving in a direction. And sometimes that direction feels like a backslide when you see greater numbers of people reporting. But I think there's also a sense of hope that more people feel safe to report. That still needs to increase.
Yeah, I pretty much want to dovetail what Robin Henry said. I'm also for women's studies. I'm Doris Chang, I'm a faculty. And I used to work with Carolyn Williams. Okay, so when it comes to domestic violence, I think 1 of every 3 women will be a victim of domestic violence sometimes during her lifetime. Yep. And the statistics about sexual assault is like 1 of every 4 women on the college campus will experience either sexual assault or attempted sexual assault. Yeah, so it's a sizable minority of women and girls, yeah. And, but just to look at a more bright side, I think even though we think that Wichita or Kansas is so conservative and red, but actually if you look at our 2 women governors, you know, since I've been here, there's Kathleen Sebelius, and then now there's Laura Kelly, and they are believing in working in a bipartisan way. You know, and now recently we just voted in Brendan Whipple as our new mayor, and he's also very progressive. So if we look at the bright side, we not think that, you know, it's always so black and white or, you know, red and blue. Yeah. So, yeah, that's all I have to say.
Well, one of my favorite slides to show students on really kind of the last day of class is the county breakdown of the 2000 election. Because we look at the election, we see blue and red states. But if you look at it county by county, you are seeing light reds and dark reds and light blues and purples in a way that is much more reflective of the complex nature of how we live our lives. That we're not wholly conservative or wholly progressive in any one moment of our lives. That the communities that we live in are diverse in their views and their stances on a number of different subject matters. And that, again, places that we dismiss in calling them flyover states like Kansas or cities like Wichita are so much different and in many ways more radical than we imagine them to be. And I think that is an important thing to keep in mind as we kind of go out into the cold, either the figurative or literal cold, but just to keep in mind that we are part of a community that has a long-standing spirit of radicalism and of questions and progressiveness and opportunity. I think Carolyn made a really good point that being taught and being shown that one person can make a change is an incredible lesson and something really incredible to take heart.
I want to remind everyone that at the beginning of the 20th century, the GOP had a big faction calling themselves progressives. Yeah. And they were progressive too. And they tried to create an urban environment that was welcoming, that was healthy, that would boost the physical health and the spirituality of all the immigrants coming from the South to the cities, from the rural areas to the cities, from Europe to the cities. So don't give up. The world is not, change is the only thing that doesn't change.
All right.